15 helicopters would bring in 140 Rangers and Delta Force commandos. Their target, a compound near the Olympic Hotel, where they believe ID's men are meeting. They would drop to the ground on ropes, capture them, and get out on a waiting convoy of trucks. There had been 6 missions prior to this one. How was this one different?
The only thing that was different is that we knew it was in a bad area of town. It was near a bad section of town.
It's only a 2-mile jump from their base at the Mogadishu airport, only minutes away by helicopter. But they're headed into the heart of ID's stronghold. As they come in, the helicopter props churn up dark clouds of dust, making it hard to see.
We were way up there, and then the dust propelled so much dirt that we had to go even higher, and he couldn't really see where he wanted us to go.
Once the bird comes in and flares, it was brown out for a good 10 seconds. You couldn't see anything.
From right there, it felt, you know, you just knew something was up.
When did the shooting begin?
Before we came in there.
Before you were even out of the choppers, they were firing.
I could hear rounds explode right outside the chopper door.
Amidst the flying dust and intense gunfire, the Delta commandos begin rounding up nearly 24 of ID's top lieutenants. What they lacked in surprise, they're making up for with speed. They plan to be in and out in just 40 minutes, despite an unexpected problem. A Ranger, PFC Todd Blackburn, has fallen off the rope, 60 feet to the ground below.
I was on the rope when I fell. I heard firing, and so I remember looking back and seeing the other door was already gone and thinking, geez, we're just sitting up here like sitting ducks and wanting to get out of the helicopter. And that's all I can remember.
His comrades later tell him that Sergeant Casey Joyce is the man who coordinated his rescue, laying down cover fire for medic Marcus Good.
You got to decide whether you want to move him, because if we don't get him out of there, he's going to die. We loaded him up, and Sergeant Joyce said, "You're going to stay with him?" I said, "Yeah," and he shut the tailgate, and he headed back towards his blocking position.
And I did really, really good. It saved my life, actually.
With Blackburn taken care of, Sergeant Joyce and his fellow Rangers have things under control for the moment. What's happening back at the target location?
I got the call that the targets have been secured. Prepare for extraction.
We were all lined up in the street. I mean, we were...
Mission was done as far as we were concerned, waiting to go.
We were this far from actually getting on the trucks and leaving, right when it happened.
The entire operation is right on schedule when disaster strikes. An American helicopter is in trouble.
I could just see the bird come into sight, and I looked up at it, and I noticed it was spinning kind of funny. I thought it was turning around trying to hit a target, but it was kind of drifting down towards the ground.
My forward observer saw the bird go down.
It disappeared, and I knew it had crashed.
And then the whole thing changed. It was a whole different mission then.
That was the decisive moment, wasn't it? Once the chopper went down, what went through your minds?
Guess we're going to be here a little bit longer than expected.
When we come back, the rescue mission, the battle, and the political miscalculation in Washington that cost American lives in Somalia.
Still ahead, Phillips.
Continuing our story now. You've heard about the vehement debate that had been going on here in Washington. Go after a deed, negotiate with him. Stay in Somalia, get out. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Mogadishu, a pivotal moment. A battle that never would have happened, and a controversy that might never have erupted if it weren't for a random shot in the sky that brought down an American helicopter. Todd Blackburn, the Ranger who'd fallen from the chopper, had been rescued by Sergeant Casey Joyce. But Blackburn would never see him again. And neither would Joyce's 22-year-old wife, Deanna, who had talked to her husband just after midnight that Sunday, October 3rd.
It was 1 o'clock Somalia time when I spoke to Casey.
What was he like? What did he talk about?
He was tired. He said he was ready to come home, that he missed me and he loved me, and to tell his parents that he missed him and loved him. And he gave me a list of things he wanted. He'd broken his Walkman, and he wanted a new Walkman. And then we got off the phone, and the funniest thing was I was putting down the phone and heard him going, "Hey, hey." And so I picked it back up and said, "Yes." He said, "Tell me one more time you love me." That's how it ended.
Hours later, Sergeant Casey Joyce and the other 140 men of Task Force Ranger are about to make a fateful decision. That Black Hawk helicopter is down on the hostile streets of Mogadishu.
You knew you weren't leaving till you made sure that whoever was there was out, you know? That's what I mean by, you know, we're gonna be here a little bit longer.
Your first instinct is, let's go get them, because you know someone's in there hurting.
The chopper, downed by rocket-propelled grenades, falls into a narrow alley about 3 blocks to the east of where the Rangers are. What happens over the next 10 hours is a story most Americans have not heard. The 9 Rangers we interviewed at Fort Benning, Georgia, survived a battle the Army has called the most intense ground combat since the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. But the critical decisions they made on the streets that day were based on a solemn Ranger creed. I will never allow a fallen comrade to fall into the hands of the enemy.
First thing I thought of was I hope they could get there before the Somalis could, because like a week or 2 before, a helicopter crashed before, and there was no one there for them, and I didn't want that to happen to our guys. I wanted the Rangers to get there to protect them.
So the first in a succession of rescue missions is launched, each more costly than the one before it.
I had 15 guys with me. I left 8 there and took 7 to go secure the crash site.
Lieutenant Tom DiTomaso and his men begin running through the twisted alleys and courtyards of Mogadishu, racing a large Somali crowd that has the same objective, the helicopter.
So we were running on a street parallel to them. They were running down one street, we were down and running the other, and the crash site was right in between us.
What was it like as you made your way there?
As we were running down the street, every time we went by a window, a muzzle would come out and just spray the street, and then they would pull back in. The crowd is running, and you can hear them all yelling and screaming, and I mean, they're right on the other side of the building. And we came around the corner, and one of the smaller aircraft had landed at the crash site and tried to extract some wounded men.
That smaller aircraft, called a Little Bird, has made a perilous landing to try to save the survivors of the crashed Black Hawk.
They took 2 wounded men, put them on that helicopter. That helicopter took off. And I tapped my head at the pilot, which means head count, and he shook his head no.
What did that mean?
It meant there were still bodies, still men there.
That he hadn't gotten them all?
Right.
The Rangers arrived seconds before the Somalis and set up a perimeter around the downed helicopter. The body of the pilot killed in the crash, Chief Warrant Officer Clifton Walcott, is pinned in the wreckage. The Rangers would guard his body for 12 hours until 5 a.m. the next day. Their loyalty measured in American lives. And how would you describe the level of fire?
I just remember explosions all over the place. And we just started returning fire, and it was just so close. I mean, they were only right across the street. And out of the buildings around that area, people were just throwing grenades outside the top, from the top windows.
425, crowds are building. Enemy fire is taking its toll as more Rangers advance on the crash site.
The element that I was in charge of was 16 men, and very quickly it turned to 3. One guy was down because of shrapnel wounds, because an RPG exploded right over his head. You know, I started my forward observer. You know, he got shot. Because the streets are so narrow, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. We were about 200 meters away, but as soon as we made that left turn, it was just like a wall of lead.
You know, for a minute there, it seems like training. You're out there doing what you're trained to do, and then you'll hear that someone start screaming, "I've been hit," and it snaps you into reality.
They're under withering fire, but they have a problem returning fire, because in classic guerrilla fashion, the Somalis are exploiting the rules of engagement.
People were using other people for shields. The men would stand behind the women and put their weapon up underneath their armpits, so the barrel was just coming out like this and shooting.
4:30 in the afternoon, Rangers and hundreds of Somalis are fighting pitched battles at close range.
We're taking fire from 3 directions, from, you know, directly to our front, from our left and right.
And they came from about 100 meters away and on in. You could see women darting across the street, men darting across the street.
It was that quick. You'd see them move to an alley, and then the fire would come out of windows.
By now, the Rangers trying to free the pilot's body are outnumbered 30-1. So the rest of the force, waiting back at the original landing site near the Olympic Hotel, including Sergeant Casey Joyce, rushed to the crash site. But in unarmored vehicles, the trucks and Humvees they used to get there become death traps. You were basically sitting ducks.
Yes, sir.
As long as you stayed in the truck.
Yes, sir.
Specialist Dave Ritchie was part of the team trying to rescue the Rangers at the crash site. He declined to tell us what he did that day, but his lieutenant did.
Let me tell you, I know he's not going to tell this story because of the way he is, but
Just to give you a picture of how much fire they were under, on the vehicles you have a top gunner. Well, he was in one of the vehicles. That gunner got shot. The squad leader in that vehicle pulled down the gunner, started doing first aid. He jumped up there, this is Sergeant Ruiz, and started firing the weapon system. He was killed there. Specialist Ritchie pulls him down and jumps back up there.
5 o'clock, as they struggle to reach the crash site, the Somalis are setting up roadblocks. The 3-block trip becomes a nightmare.
They'd go down one street and be blocked. They'd have to come back around, try to go through another way, and a lot of times we just end up going in a circle.
And now, all of a sudden, they can't find us. Well, we had no idea what they were going through.
In fact, the second group of Rangers is stopped dead in its tracks. Sergeant Casey Joyce would be the next to fall.
Vehicles were hit, and there were Rangers lying in the street. Sergeant Joyce turned and was engaging the enemy when a round came and hit him in the back.
It was instantaneous, I'm sure. They could tell that he had a sucking chest wound. And with a sucking chest wound, you don't last long. But I think he was unconscious through all of that. I want to believe that, and I do.
About 6:30 in the morning, I got a knock at the door, but I was walking down the stairs, and I was telling myself, he's dead, he's dead. And I opened the door, and it was 2 children, my neighbors. And, you know, I was kind of kicking myself for thinking, when those kids came by, that, you know, I was thinking, why were you thinking that? And then I came downstairs, and I had school that morning, so I fixed me some cereal. And I got another knock at the door, and this time I let my guard down because I thought it was the children again, you know, maybe going to tell me something that they had forgotten. I opened the door, and it was 3 officers, and they told me. But they had my name wrong, so I started to close the door and told them that I wasn't who. They said, "Are you Dina?" I said, "No." I shut the door, and they said, "Are you Mrs. Joyce?" And then they told me that, "We're sorry to inform you your husband was killed in Somalia."
Back in Mogadishu, night falls. The second group of Rangers, now carrying the body of Casey Joyce, finally gives up its rescue mission. Still another group tries to get to the crash site, but without the armored vehicles that Washington has denied them, they're unable to fight through an ambush at this traffic circle. At 6 o'clock in the evening, they too turn back. The 90 Americans at the crash site, still struggling to free the dead pilot, are on their own.
We dragged all the casualties inside a building, but we couldn't yet leave because that one pilot was still trapped in the helicopter.
The Rangers can do nothing more than hunker down in the nearby buildings still occupied by frightened Somalis.
We moved them out of the front rooms because, you know, we didn't want them to get hit, and
they understood that. Believe me, I mean, I was holding one of their babies.
Helicopters fly all night long, dropping supplies and ammunition on the American position. Finally, at 2 a.m., almost 11 hours after their mission began, a column of friendly troops fights its way in.
What was it like when those guys arrived?
I wanted to
water?
hug them. And, got any water? They gave us water. They had some extra IVs. We were really happy to see them.
But as it turned out, U.S. commanders had spent 5 hours trying to assemble the equipment they needed to rescue the Rangers. And to do it, the most powerful army in the world had to go asking for help to save its own soldiers.
And you know what kind of vehicles got through? Malaysian and Pakistani armor and APCs made it through. But the American commanders on the ground literally had to cajole through the UN command their allies to free up their vehicles.
We put our casualties on the armored personnel carriers. They drove off, and we continued to work on the pilot.
By 5 a.m., 18 Rangers are dead, 75 others wounded. At least 300 Somalis have been killed. Their total casualties, well over 1,000. But the Rangers have honored their creed. The body of helicopter pilot Clifton Walcott has finally been freed from the crash wreckage and kept from enemy hands. There's no reason to stay any longer. The battle is over, but the fallout is about to begin. Only hours after their terrible ordeal, the Rangers were in for another staggering blow. The very thing they had fought so valiantly to prevent had happened anyway. American soldiers had fallen into enemy hands. That story when we come back. Murky. The reality is, when the Rangers returned to their barracks that day in October, they had no idea that the powers that be here in Washington were looking for a diplomatic settlement. They were exhausted, drained, the battle was behind them. But as they soon found out, the nightmare was far from over. This is the first thing the surviving Rangers saw when they got back to base. And this is the first thing they heard.
Mike Durant, U.S. Army.
At about the same time that Casey Joyce was killed, there had been a second helicopter crash about a mile away. The 4 Rangers on board were killed by a Somali mob. So were the 2 Delta Force commandos who roped down to help them and fought to their death. Pilot Michael Durant was taken hostage and the dead dragged through the streets. Despite the valor they displayed and the sacrifices they made, the Rangers now understood the worst had happened anyway.
You know, you saw in the news exactly what was going on, and that's what, you know, hit hard for all of us. And the reality just kicked in.
Shocking images of dead Americans were already being broadcast around the world. The Rangers were furious at the media.
I don't know who the heck they think they are, whether they think we're machines or something, but that affected every single one of us.
Images of Somalis dragging through the streets of Mogadishu the body of one of the dead Americans.
Those pictures seemed to instantly galvanize U.S. public opinion against American policy in Somalia. The hunt for Aidid was effectively ended the next day. A complete withdrawal was ordered. On October 8th, 5 days after the battle, Casey Joyce was buried at Arlington National Cemetery.
Casey had requested in writing before he left that if he was killed in action, he wanted to be buried in Arlington with full military honors.
It was a hard day. Casey wanted to be buried there, so we did it for him. You know, everything he wanted, I stuck with it.
The family received a call from the Secretary of Defense offering to take part in the ceremony.
Les Aspin asked to drape the colors on your husband's casket.
And to give me the flag.
And to give
also.
you the flag.
Mm-hmm. We just said no. I said no.
For Larry Joyce, a retired Army colonel with 2 combat tours in Vietnam, the burial of his son was the beginning of a mission to confront the generals and politicians he believed had sent his son to war for all the wrong reasons.
If we were working toward a diplomatic solution, the last 2 or 3 weeks in September, why would we conduct a raid on October the 3rd? That makes absolutely no sense at all.
The hunt for Aidid, he says, was not vital to American interests. The mission, he says, lacked a clear objective. And the politicians in Washington, he insists, did not have the will to stay the course.
October the 3rd, capturing him was the most important thing we had going. We lose 18 soldiers, 76 more are wounded, and on October the 4th, we suddenly do an about-face.
That kind of confusion about foreign military adventures was painfully reminiscent of what Larry Joyce had lived through 25 years ago.
I contend that Casey and I served the same misguided policy a generation apart.
You in Vietnam?
And Casey in Somalia.
In the weeks after his son's death, Joyce published articles, met with congressmen, and spoke out about what he considered unnecessary deaths in Somalia. Secretary of Defense Les Aspin acknowledged that his decision not to provide armor to Task Force Ranger was a tragic mistake.
Had I known at that time what I knew after the events of Sunday, I would have made a very different decision.
He resigned on December 15th. That same month, in a bitter irony for the Rangers, American troops were actually providing security for the very man they had once tried to kill. Mohammed Aidid, the warlord, was now a welcome participant at a peace conference in Ethiopia.
I mean, it was kind of a 2-track policy, a carrot and stick, if you will. We often engage in that kind of...
Stone, it didn't work, did it?
Committee will come to order.
This spring, Larry Joyce's crusade reached Washington. The Senate Armed Services Committee began hearings on the disaster in Somalia, with inconclusive testimony about whether American lives would have been saved with additional armor. But Larry Joyce finally had a chance to put a human face on a flawed policy that claimed the life of his son.
Maybe some of you remember where you were and what you were doing last October 3. Now, my life was about as close to being perfect as it has ever been, or ever will be again. I had a 7:30 tee time on a public course that runs along Lake Michigan. It was a cool and beautiful Sunday morning in Chicago. But halfway around the world in Mogadishu, it was a hot and dusty Sunday afternoon where Casey and his Ranger and Delta Force comrades were taking off in helicopters. As I was putting on the third green, Casey was dodging AK-47 rounds as he was rescuing PFC Todd Blackburn. As I was getting out of the rough and onto the fifth fairway, Casey was fighting his way to the crash site. As I was walking off the ninth green, some of Casey's buddies were fighting their way back to the Mogadishu airport in a Humvee with Casey's lifeless body aboard. In the time it takes to play 9 holes of golf, a tragedy of enormous proportions had unfolded. Lives, including my son's, had been taken.
What's even more disturbing is that 9 months after Casey Joyce was shot dead in the streets of Mogadishu, even those insiders who had a hand in the Somalia policy can't quite figure out how the disaster on October 3rd came to be.
Where were you on October 3rd?
I was here in Washington, and I was shocked. I couldn't see just how in the world we could be pursuing a policy of shifting from the military to the political track while at the same time allowing these military actions by our forces out there who are under our control to continue. That I was totally mystified.
So word just hadn't filtered down?
The standing orders were never changed. Why? I don't know. I wasn't there.
Les Aspin is gone. All of the troops are out of Somalia. Mistakes have been acknowledged. What more do you want?
What do I want out of this? I want to make sure it doesn't happen again. How do you do that? Through the hearings, identify those who are responsible and hold them accountable for what happened in Somalia.
With all due respect, is there a little bit of Monday morning quarterbacking going on here?
Sure. Don't you think I'm authorized to do a little Monday morning quarterbacking? I do.
What questions have you been left with?
I really don't have any questions. I mean, now I'm just trying to deal day to day with the loss of my husband. So, with a man I was supposed to spend the rest of my life with.
When the government says, hey, go do it, we will go do it. You know, all these men volunteered to do this, and when the government says go do it, we'll do it. All I ask, in my own opinion, is that they make the right decision. You know, they got to understand that there may be casualties, and they need to be willing to accept that. They need to be able to look Colonel Joyce and all the other families in the face and say, you know, we understand and we are willing to accept those casualties. Don't send me somewhere and expect me to do a job and not take casualties. That's impossible.
I want people to know, hey, my friend Casey died out there, and you know, he died doing what he was doing, and he did it for, he was doing it for you, you know. That there's we are not the policymakers, we're the doers, you know, and we entrust our faith in the people who make the rules or tell us what to go do, and that's what makes the country great. Where would we be if we didn't have people like Joyce and Pilla and Lowe or Reese and Cavaco? Where would we be without them? I want people to remember that you had people that died enforcing the policies of this government for you. Make any sense?
Well, our story focused on one American who died, Sergeant James Casey Joyce. Keep in mind that at least 300 Somalis were killed, as well as 17 other U.S. soldiers. Here are the names of those Americans who lost their lives that day.